The night Piper Malone walked into the Royal Conservatory's practice annex at 11:15 on a Tuesday, she was not expecting to find a man bleeding onto the Steinway. She stopped in the doorway, her cello case bumping the frame, her breath catching somewhere between her throat and her chest. The overhead fluorescents were off. Only the emergency exit sign threw anything into the room, that flat institutional red that makes everything look like a crime scene even when it isn't. Tonight it was. The man was sitting on the bench, not playing, just sitting, one hand pressed to his side, the other resting on the keys without pressing them. He'd tracked blood across 3 white keys. F. G. A. Piper's first instinct was to back out. Her second instinct, the one her mother had spent 26 years trying to train out of her, was to step forward. She stepped forward. "You need a hospital," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked up. He had the kind of face that belonged on a different continent, somewhere with older architecture and colder winters. Dark eyes that had clearly spent a long time deciding whether to trust anything. He looked at her the way you look at a car alarm going off, present, annoying, potentially someone else's problem. "I need you to leave," he said. His accent was faint. English with something underneath it, or maybe the other way around. "You're bleeding on a Steinway D. I'm aware. That piano costs more than my student debt." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a reaction, more like a small recalibration. "Are you a student here?" "Graduate. Performance. And I have a key to this room because I booked it until midnight, so technically you're the one who shouldn't be here." She set her cello case down along the wall, carefully, the way you set things down when your hands are shaking, but you don't want anyone to see. "Let me look at that. You're not a doctor. I'm a registered nurse, or I was before I went back for the performance degree. So I've seen worse than whatever you've done to yourself, and I'm the only person in this building right now, and if you pass out on that bench, I'm calling 911 regardless of what you want." He said nothing for a long moment. The emergency exit hummed. Somewhere 3 floors up, a heating duct ticked. "Fine," he said. His name, she would find out much later, was Rafferty Brine. Not that he told her, not that night. She peeled back his jacket, Italian wool, which she noted because it was the kind of detail you notice when you're trying not to notice the larger situation, and found a wound that was ugly but not deep. Entry only. Whatever had gone in had come back out, or been removed. She'd seen puncture wounds in the ER during her placement years. This was something like that, but cleaner. Professional, some part of her mind offered, before she told that part to be quiet. She worked with what was in the first aid kit behind the piano room door, which had apparently never been updated since the 90s, and contained mostly gauze, surgical tape, and a single antiseptic wipe that had dried to a stiff little rectangle inside its packet. She was not complaining. She made it work. He didn't make a sound the entire time. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" "No. Are you going to tell me your name?" The smallest pause. "Rafferty Piper," she said, "and before you say anything, yes, like the instrument." "No, I don't play it. Do you want me to call someone for you?" "No. Do you want me to pretend I was never here?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in that look was different from the calculation before, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with it. "That would be useful," he said. "Then you owe me one," she said, and went to unpack her cello. She didn't expect to see him again. Toronto was a big city. The Conservatory was a small one. A small world, more accurately. The kind of place where the same 40 people kept rotating through each other's orbits. But men like Rafferty Brine, whatever men like him were, didn't orbit places like this twice. She was wrong about that. He was there 2 weeks later when she came in for her morning practice slot. Not in the piano room. In the corridor outside it, in a different jacket, no visible injuries, looking at a notice board covered in concert listings, with the mild attention of someone who was looking at something else entirely. She stopped walking. He turned his head. "You're not supposed to be in the graduate annex without a keycard," she said. The door was open. It wasn't. She knew it wasn't because she'd swiped in 15 seconds ago. "What are you doing here? I wanted to return something." He held out a first aid kit. Not the depleted one from the practice room. A new one, fully stocked, the kind you'd find in a proper trauma kit. The kind that cost about $400. She recognized the brand. She took it without a word and went to put it back where the old one had been. When she came out, he was still there. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know. Most people would have just left. I'm not most people. She already knew that. Are you going to tell me what happened that night?" "No. Are you going to keep showing up in places you shouldn't be?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. Probably. "Great," Piper said, and went to practice. The thing about growing up the way Piper Malone had grown up, small house in Barrie, Ontario, mother, working double shifts at the Simcoe County Hospital, father gone before she had a word for gone, was that you learned early to read the room. You learned to read the weight of a silence before you said the wrong thing into it. You learned to notice who was watching which exit. You learned that the quietest people in any given space were usually the ones most worth paying attention to. Rafferty Brine was the quietest person she'd ever been near. Not in the way shy people are quiet. In the way that a building is quiet, not empty, just everything happening inside. She told herself it wasn't her business. She had a thesis to finish, a jury performance in the spring, and a student loan that had been accruing interest since she'd deferred it to come back for the degree. She had a roommate named Constance who left passive-aggressive notes on the refrigerator, and a supervisor named Dr. Hollins who had decided, for reasons Piper couldn't entirely reconstruct, that her interpretation of the Elgar was emotionally immature. She did not have the bandwidth for a mystery. She also didn't have the willpower to stop noticing him. He came back 3 more times over the following month, always with a reason that was almost plausible. Once he needed to speak to someone in administration, and had come to the wrong floor. Once he was there when she arrived and gone before she could ask. The 3rd time he came to her practice room directly, knocked twice, and when she opened the door he was holding 2 coffees from the place on Bloor she only went to when she was celebrating something. She let him in. They talked for 2 hours. She told him about Barrie, about nursing school, about the year she'd saved enough to buy a student cello and realized she'd been making a mistake every other year of her life. He told her almost nothing. A city she couldn't verify, a line of work he called logistics, the fact that he'd been in Toronto 3 years and found it tolerable, which was the most Canadian response to a city she'd ever heard from someone who wasn't Canadian. At the end of it, when he stood to leave, she said, "I looked up the wound." He paused. The presentation, the depth, the angle, the fact that you'd clearly had it looked at before I got there but needed it redressed. She set her bow down carefully. Someone in your line of work who doesn't want a hospital record. That's a specific situation. He turned back to look at her. His expression was very still. "I'm not going to ask," she said. "I just want you to know that I know, so we can stop pretending I'm too innocent to notice a beat. Then, most people find it safer not to notice." "I've never been very good at safe," she said. Something changed in him then. She couldn't have named it. A door opening or closing, she wasn't sure which. Either way, things were different after that. His name was Rafferty Brine, and he ran the Eastern Seaboard operations of something she didn't yet have a name for. She'd work that out gradually, the way you work out the dimensions of a room in the dark, by walking into the walls. The first wall she walked into was a man named Hendrik Coyle. Hendrik Coyle appeared in her life on a Thursday, in February, which was already a cruel month without his assistance. She'd just come out of a disastrous run-through of her thesis performance. Dr. Hollins had said the words affectless technique without irony, and she was walking to the parking garage on St. George with her cello on her back and her headphones in, not paying enough attention to the man who fell into step. Beside her, he was large. Not in the way athletes are large, in the way that suggests a profession where size is a functional asset. He was smiling, which made it worse, not better. "Piper Malone," he said. She took one headphone out. "I don't know you." "No." "But you know someone I'm very interested in." He said Rafferty's name. He said it the way you'd say a word you'd found written on a piece of evidence. Piper kept walking. I'm not sure what you're talking about. You patched him up at the Conservatory, November 14th, a Tuesday. He smiled again. We know about the piano room. Her steps didn't slow. She'd learned that too, somewhere between Barry and nursing school and the particular education of watching her mother navigate a world that wasn't built to make things easy for her. You didn't let them see you recalibrate. I helped someone who'd been hurt. I'm a trained nurse. That's what we do. And the subsequent visits, I don't know what you're, Miss Malone. His voice dropped. Just slightly. Just enough. I'm not here to frighten you. I just need you to pass along a message. Tell Brian that the arrangement with the Port Authority is over. Tell him Coyle says the window closes Friday. He'll know what that means. He peeled away at the next corner. She walked the remaining 2 blocks to the garage without altering her pace, took the elevator up, sat in her car, and did not allow herself to shake until the doors were closed and no one could see. Then she called Rafferty. He picked up on the second ring. A man named Hendrik Coyle just approached me, she said. He knew about the piano room. He wants you to know the arrangement with the Port Authority is over and the window closes Friday. A pause. He was following me, Rafferty. The silence on the other end was brief, but it had texture. Are you home? Not yet. Go home, lock the door. I'll come to you. I don't want you to Piper. That was the first time he said her name like that, like it was something he was being careful with. Please. She went home. He came 40 minutes later, no jacket despite the February, and when she let him in, he did something she hadn't anticipated. He looked at her first. Not the apartment, not the windows, not the exits, the way she'd watched him assess every room they'd been in together. He looked at her first. Are you all right? Yes, she said. What have you gotten me into? He sat at her kitchen table. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked like someone who was working out how much truth to give another person. Coyle runs a competing operation, he said finally. Import-export. The Port Authority contract keeps the whole structure functional. If he gets to it first, we lose about 60% of our distribution channels. Distribution channels for what? The pause was long enough that she understood what it meant. Legal or not? She asked. Complicated. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not entirely legal. She'd already known. She'd known in the piano room when she looked at the wound and understood it was professional. She'd known in the corridor with the first aid kit. She'd known on some frequency below words, since the first night she'd seen the way he assessed a space. She'd still let him in. She wasn't sure what that said about her and wasn't ready to find out. Is Coyle dangerous? Yes. To me specifically, he was sending a message. He chose you because you're connected to me. Rafferty's jaw was tight. That won't happen again. How do you know? Because I'll make sure of it. That should have been the moment she said, I'm sorry, but I don't want any part of this. She knew she should say it. She'd helped him out of nothing more than professional reflex and perverse curiosity, and she owed him nothing, and she had a thesis to finish. She said, What do you need? He looked at her. Nothing. This isn't your problem. He made it my problem on St. George Street, and I'm better at logistics than you apparently think. She poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from him. I spent 4 years as an ER nurse. I have a very high tolerance for complicated situations and a talent for staying calm when things get loud. Tell me what the window actually means and we'll figure it out together. He didn't tell her everything that night. He told her enough. The Port Authority contract was a legitimizing structure, a scaffold of real business that held a much larger architecture upright. If Coyle reached the supervising director, a man named Walter Finch, who had been accommodating for the right considerations for the better part of a decade before Rafferty could, the entire operation would need to be rebuilt from scratch. And rebuilding it would take time no one had. What he didn't know, what she would spend the next 72 hours helping him understand, was that Walter Finch had already been approached. Not by Coyle. By someone higher than Coyle, someone whose name Rafferty didn't have yet, and Finch had been frightened enough that he'd left the city. Piper knew this because Finch's daughter was in her cellist's chamber group. She'd heard it 3 weeks ago and filed it under None of My Business, which was a folder she apparently needed to clean out. She didn't explain how she knew things. She just knew things. She'd always known things. The names of the night porters at every hospital she'd worked in, who in the Conservatory administration was unhappy enough to want a change, which professors were actually on good terms with the faculty board, and which ones only thought they were. Her mother had called it paying attention. Her old nursing supervisor had called it emotional intelligence and marked it as a strength on her evaluations. Rafferty looked at her across the kitchen table and said, slowly, "How do you know about Finch's daughter?" "She's second chair in my chamber group. She's been distracted for weeks and I asked her if everything was all right. She told me her father had gone to stay with her uncle in Halifax and couldn't say when he'd be back." Piper looked at him steadily. "You need to go to Halifax." He stared at her. "Not you personally. Someone Finch will talk to. Someone low enough in the hierarchy that it doesn't read like pressure." She tilted her head. "Someone he wouldn't see coming." "You," he said. "I was a nurse. People tell nurses things they won't tell anyone else. I have an excellent face for receiving information without reacting to it. You might have noticed." She held his gaze. "And his daughter trusts me." Rafferty was quiet for a long time. "This isn't your world." "No, but I've been in it since November, apparently. I'd rather be useful than just adjacent." It was not, she would reflect later, the most rational decision she'd ever made, but she'd made worse ones. She'd gone back for the music degree, hadn't she? She flew to Halifax on a Saturday, told her roommate Constance she had a family thing, and met Walter Finch at a diner on Barrington Street that his daughter had named. He was a small man, the kind of small that comes from years of making himself less visible, with reading glasses on a chain and a coffee he kept wrapping both hands around. He looked at her across the table and said, "You're not one of Coyle's people?" "No," she said. "I'm a cellist, also a former nurse. Rafferty Brine sent me because you'd know what Coyle's people look like, and I don't look like that." Walter Finch looked at her for a long time, then he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "No," he said, "you definitely don't." He told her what he knew. She listened the way she'd listened to patients, fully, without preparing her next question while someone was still speaking. The person above Coyle had a name, Maren Tulloch, which she wrote down. Not in a notebook. She'd learned in the last 72 hours that Rafferty's world had opinions about notebooks. She remembered it. Maren Tulloch was not a name Rafferty had. Piper could tell by the quality of the silence when she called him from the airport. "She's above Coyle," he said. "She's the reason Coyle moved on the Port Authority. He's working for her, not independently." Piper watched her gate number go up on the departures board. "Finch says she's been building toward this for 2 years. The Port Authority is a pressure point. She wants to use it to push you out of the Eastern operations entirely." "Who is she?" "I don't know yet. He didn't. But he said she has people inside the Port Authority already, beyond Finch, 2 or 3 of them. The Friday deadline is real, but the window isn't about the contract. It's about getting Finch back in place before those people can remove him." Rafferty's voice, when he responded, had a quality she'd never heard in it before. It was, she thought, something close to relief. "Come home safe. I'm at the airport, Rafferty. I'm fine." Come home safe anyway. She came home safe. What happened in the 2 weeks after that she understood only partially and in outline rather than detail. She knew it involved a conversation with someone at the Port Authority that Rafferty described, in the understatement she was beginning to recognize as his primary mode, as difficult. She knew Coyle backed off. She stopped seeing the particular dark sedan that had been making regular appearances in her peripheral vision, and she knew that the Friday deadline passed without consequence. She knew Rafferty visited Finch in Halifax himself, eventually, and that Finch returned to Toronto in the first week of March. She also knew, because she was Piper Malone from Barrie, Ontario, who paid attention, that none of it was resolved. It was postponed. Maren Tulloch hadn't withdrawn. She'd waited. She wasn't surprised when Rafferty told her. They were walking along the harbourfront in the particular cold that descends on Toronto in late February and refuses to leave until it's good and ready. He told her that Tulloch had escalated, that she had approached two of Rafferty's key people directly, which meant she knew who they were, which meant there was a leak somewhere inside the operation. That the leak complicated everything. "You need to find it," Piper said. "Yes." "Do you have people you trust enough to run it internally?" He was quiet. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you know about Tulloch." He looked at her sideways. "Why? Because I'm asking, and because I found Finch." She pulled her coat tighter. The lake was doing something aggressive with the wind. "I also want to know what happens if you don't resolve this. Worst case, the Eastern operation shuts down. Everything relocates. It's a rebuild of 3, maybe 4 years, and you?" "I manage. That's not what I asked." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The water was flat and grey and going on forever in the direction of the United States. "I'd be fine," he said. "Is that actually true?" He turned to look at her. That look again. The one she'd first seen in the practice room when she'd stepped forward instead of back. Like he was seeing something he hadn't expected and didn't have a category for. "Probably not entirely," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd ever told her. She was the one who found the leak. Not on purpose. Or not entirely on purpose. She'd been doing what she'd always done, which was pay attention. And what she'd noticed was that a man named Garrett Ostro, who handled the accounting architecture of the operation, and whom she'd met twice at the kind of dinners she'd been attending with increasing regularity as her proximity to Rafferty's world shifted from accidental to acknowledged, kept looking at his phone when certain things were said. She didn't say anything about it directly. She mentioned it once to Rafferty, the way you might mention the weather. "I notice Ostro checks his phone when logistics routes come up. It's probably nothing." It was not nothing. Rafferty handled Garrett Ostro. She didn't ask how. She noticed Ostro stopped appearing at dinners. What she also noticed, in the space that opened up after that, was that Rafferty's people looked at her differently. Not with suspicion. With something that took her a while to name, adjustment. Like they were recalibrating an assumption they'd made before they had enough information. She understood the feeling. She was doing the same thing herself. Maren Tulloch made her move in the second week of March. She came at it laterally. Not through the Port Authority anymore, not through Coyle, but through a financial institution that held a significant piece of the operation's legitimate infrastructure. It was elegant. Piper would give her that. It was also the kind of move that required someone on the inside of that institution to enable it, and as it happened, Piper knew someone. She'd nursed him through a cardiac event in 2021. His name was Donald Pritchard, and he was the Deputy Director of Risk Compliance at the bank in question, and he owed her a phone call. She made it on a Wednesday afternoon, from the practice room where she'd first found Rafferty, sitting on the piano bench with her phone in both hands. Pritchard told her what she needed to know. He also asked, with the directness of someone who had recently been reminded that life was short, what she was doing in a situation like this. "Honestly," she said, "I'm not entirely sure, but I'm in it." She walked out of the practice room and called Rafferty. "I need you to listen," she said, "and then I need you to act fast, because the window on this one is about 18 hours. He listened. He acted fast. The move Tulloch had set up at the bank was reversed before it landed. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way the best interventions are quiet. A conversation, a clarification, a risk compliance review initiated from inside the institution itself that surfaced concerns well before anything irregular could process. Donald Pritchard would describe it if anyone asked, as routine. No one asked. Coyle withdrew from the Port Authority position entirely the following Monday. It wasn't announced. He was simply no longer there. Maren Tulloch, as far as Piper could determine from what Rafferty was willing to tell her, was in the process of a strategic retreat. She hadn't given up. She'd recognized the shape of what she was up against and had gone to regroup. "She'll try again," Rafferty said. They were at her kitchen table again. It was nearly midnight. He'd brought food, which he did sometimes now without making it into anything, just food, on the table available. "I know," Piper said. "You'll be ready. We'll be ready." She looked at him across the table. He said it like a fact. Like something that had already been decided in some conversation she hadn't quite been present for but had apparently participated in. She thought about the piano room, the emergency exit sign, and the blood on FGA. The moment she'd stepped forward instead of back, and the version of her life that had been running since. "I still have a thesis to finish," she said. "I know, and Hollins is going to say the Elgar is emotionally immature again. Tell him he's wrong. You haven't heard me play. I've heard you negotiate with Walter Finch in Halifax," he said, "and talk Pritchard into a compliance review, and identify a leak that 3 people with considerably more experience couldn't find." He looked at her steadily. "You are not emotionally immature." She laughed. It surprised her. It seemed to surprise him too, but in a way he didn't mind. "Come hear me play," she said. "The jury's in April." Front row," he said. She played the Elgar in April. She played it the way she'd been trying to play it all year, not technically correctly, not with the careful precision that Dr. Hollins valued and that produced performances that were competent and entirely forgettable, but with the full weight of everything she'd accumulated since November. The practice room at midnight, the drive to Halifax, the Wednesday afternoon phone call with her hands not quite steady, the voice she'd chosen to use anyway. The jury gave her a distinction. Dr. Hollins said it was the most emotionally present performance he'd seen in 5 years. She texted Rafferty from the hallway outside the recital room. Still in her concert black, he texted back 2 words, "front row." She stood in the corridor of the Royal Conservatory with her cello case on her back and $300,000 in student debt and a distinction on her thesis, and whatever the next chapter of her life was, already started, already running, somewhere between the woman she'd been and the woman she was finding out she'd always had in her, and she thought, "I stepped forward, and the rest of it followed."